Hello and welcome to the Informed Animal Ally presented by the Vancouver Humane Society. This is the Animal Ethics Podcast where we share the ins and outs of topics like cruelty, legislation, and advocacy here in BC and across Canada. Hi, I'm Chantelle, Archambault, Communications Director for the Vancouver Humane Society. Joining me as always is my co-host, VHS's Executive Director, Amy Morris.
Hello.
And today we have Brooklyn Fowler-Moros, the Manager of Companion Animal Programs.
Hello.
On this month's episode, we'll be discussing the challenges low-income pet guardians face and the systems in place to help them.
I'm going to start this episode off with a bit of a story. I grew up with dogs in my life. Some of you might relate to this idea that they were there for me even when my parents and friends and siblings weren't. At my loneliest moments, my dog was by my side. And when I left home at 18, there was this natural emptiness that came from not having a dog to spend my study time with and to give me healthy breaks in my day. And as many people do, I headed to the local SPCA and fell in love with a jailed little scruffy pup. And I've got a little photo from his nose sticking through the bars at the SPCA. And so not long after, I was caring for him. And he was about 2 years old. I learned all about trauma and dog behavior. A few years went by and I discovered that he had a medical condition that was bladder crystals that couldn't be dissolved naturally. And so as a full-time student, I scrapped together the funds for one surgery and then another a year later. And when I finished school, I had difficulty finding well-paying work. I was living right at the low-income poverty cutoff level where I could not get any government assistance, but was also really just scraping by. And then there was this freak accident at the dog park. After the emergency veterinarian, I had to go to a specialist at Canada West who worked on bones, and there's a $6,000 surgery that was required. I went into debt at that time, maxing out my credit card. I was worried about the future and paying my bills, paying my rent. I was lucky. I had a support network that I knew could help me, and I had credit card support. I came from a privileged upbringing and knew that if I didn't really have the funds, my parents would likely help me. So in the face of a pretty deeply emotionally challenging situation, I had peace of mind that I could do what was best for my pup. What I find, working at VHS is that the people we assist through Vancouver Humane Society's McVitie Fund have the same feelings as me. Their pet is their mental health lifeline, keeping them feeling connected and sane, healing from trauma, and feeling less alone. They live below the poverty cutoff level, often having just enough money to have some kind of housing, feed themselves and their pet. The big difference, though, is that when their pet's in crisis, they don't have the same support networks. They might have no access to credit and no friends or family that can offer that financial support. I think people often think that people in that kind of situation got there through some kind of fault or decision they made. But the reality is that the majority of people in this situation started their lives off with far less resources than I did, and certainly through no fault of their own. They might have been taken from their families and put into foster care as a child, or had a long medical illness that drained their finances. Everyone's story is really different about how they got to where they were and are, but the universal reality is that the love and connection they have with their pets is the same as anyone else. So just to kind of start with that story, but I'd like to get into what we know with research about low-income folks and pets. So Chantelle and Brooklyn, what does the research say?
Thanks so much for sharing that story, Amy, about your own experience. So in December of 2020, the Vancouver Humane Society released a report on addressing animal neglect through the provision of veterinary outreach services. But even the language animal neglect that we used is problematic because it implies a fault, like a failure to care for an animal properly, and that's in heavy quotation marks. So while that title language was used to make the paper more accessible and more likely to be read within the animal welfare sector, it really doesn't convey the reality of a legacy of intergenerational trauma that people have that perpetuates people not being able to get the care that they need, let alone get the care that their pet needs. That said, the report highlights the importance of supporting structurally vulnerable people with caring for their pets. So we know that animals offer companionship and they have a mutual bond with their guardians. They're part of the family. And interestingly, in a qualitative study that was also co-authored by the VHS, one of the participants noted that low-income people tend to take in animals in need when no one else can because they have compassion for the animal's situation. And speaking with people who have pets in Vancouver's downtown east side at the VHS's Because They Matter event, I've heard stories exactly like that, where people will take in animals from family or neighbors who can't care for them anymore. And as Amy mentioned, we know that people's circumstances can change when they already have a companion animal. So I was wondering, Brooklyn, what's it like to administer a program where everyone presents an urgent need for support?
It's a great question, Chantelle. I mean, I would say my first thought is it can be challenging. It can also be profoundly rewarding. I think you've both done a really good job of highlighting a lot of the structural issues that I see on a daily basis from application to application. You made an excellent point that every case is truly, genuinely so different from another, but the themes are consistently true. It's the cases that I see most often can be described as there's an acute emergency. The pet is dealing with something that is a life-threatening emergency, which I think any of us, when we even just hearing the term life-threatening, I think, can bring tension into like the chest. It's very stressful for any of us, even in the best of circumstances, to imagine a loved one, a human family member, a pet family member, to be going through a life-threatening state of distress. So when someone's contacting us and me, and when I'm speaking with them, they're going through something that has them in a profoundly difficult headspace. And you add to that some of these structural issues where you've got someone who maybe has been living off of $80 since their last paycheck, which was, that could be a week ago, it could be 2, it could be 3 weeks ago. And they've been trying to stretch $80 to buy a bag of cat food and also to get, enough Mr. Noodles or enough this, enough that to just get through. And these are really tough issues. You've got people who I talk with who have had housing for most of their lives and who, when they became a senior, they just got priced out and out and out and out, and they had one eviction and they can't pay $1,000 more a month for rent. And I've talked to seniors who've lost their housing in their elderly years. And these are the circumstances that these emergencies are popping up into. So when I came into this role and, I hear the words like we operate from a trauma-informed perspective, that's really what I try to hold in my heart in every single one of these conversations is that, yes, everyone I talk to is dealing with an acute emergency with their pet, but not everyone is dealing with it from the same starting point. I might have the same emergency and have the same emotional reaction and the same mental health impacts from when my own cat has needed life-saving surgery, but I had credit card I could put it on. I had pet insurance I could lean on to get a lot of it covered. I had, like Amy said, friends, family, a support system I could lean on. So the starting point that I'm coming into this emergency with is so much more substantial than what a lot of these people are dealing with. They've lost family members, they've maybe lost kids, they've lost parents, they've lost loved ones, their own health is compromised. They're just trying to get through the day, the week, the month, the year. So it can be challenging, absolutely. But as I started off saying, the level of reward is phenomenal when you get to talk to these folks and hear their commitment to their pet's well-being. It genuinely, and I'll tell people on the phone, it genuinely brings tears to my eyes sometimes when people say, I was addicted for X amount of years. And when I came into contact with my dog, someone once said, like, he saved me. My dog saved me. We rescued each other. And I just think that it just blows my mind, the level of dedication that people have to their pets, the people who say, I've had that $80 to live off of for the last 2 or 3 weeks. And the first step was to buy that big bag of cat food. And the second step was to figure out how am I now going to stretch that last $35 to get through. It's just incredible to me.
We've all spoken about how everyone's situation is so different, but you've started to talk about some patterns that you've seen in people and these commonalities, and everyone really loves and cares for their pets. But I also imagine you must start to notice some other types of patterns when you're dealing with people in a similar state of financial crisis. So are there any commonalities that tend to be similar amongst people who are accessing the program? Is there anything that makes every case truly unique?
I mean, from a literal level, of course, every case is literally unique. It's a different human being, it's a different pet, and a slightly different medical situation, or sometimes very different medical situations. I find myself learning all the time, because no matter how familiar I am with the things that tend to come up for pets in emergencies, every so often there's a new thing. So on a literal level, every case really is different. And I try to keep that in mind as well, too, because in terms of approach, there might be one person who wants to just have this conversation as fast as possible and get off the phone down and go back to solving the problem themselves. And I completely appreciate that. I've felt that way many conversations in my life when I'm going through stress. And there are some people who really need to talk, and they might need referrals. They might be in an acute mental health crisis. Sometimes we find ourselves giving out crisis line phone numbers, or, not so much like counseling phone numbers, but, resources for mental health support, emergency mental health support, food bank phone numbers, intake lines, shelters. I've done lots of different times talking with people about how to get into shelters. So those are the things that make each case different. But in terms of patterns, yes, I think that that's a really, really good question and a good observation. There are patterns for sure. I would say the overwhelming majority of cases cite either being a senior or being someone with a disability or multiple disabilities or being a single parent. And many people will cite multiple of the above. So these are folks who are often dealing with very substantial systemic barriers to the level of success that they're perfectly capable of. It's hard for someone to make the kind of income that might be easily accessible or easily attainable for many people. If you are able to get a master's degree education, if you had the financial and the structural support to go through something so difficult as that level of education. And it's very challenging when you're dealing with multiple disabilities and in a system where it's very hard to get social supports. For mental health disabilities, physical disabilities, mobility disabilities, it's very difficult to get the basic support that you need. So when we're trying to tell someone, these I hope that they're out of date criticisms, but things that I grew up hearing, like get a job. Well, people often have jobs, and these jobs don't pay enough to get by. They're working very hard, sometimes 40 hours a week, sometimes 60, 80 hours a week people are working to figure their budgets out, to raise their kids, to do the best that they can on an income that is not dignified to live off of. It's not possible, or it's not feasible to live or thrive on. And then like I said before, with people with multiple complex disabilities, it's very difficult when it's physically impossible or very close to impossible to get a lot of jobs that you could possibly make a good living off of. It's very hard when jobs aren't set up a lot of the time for people with physical disabilities, mental health challenges, neurodiversity, things like that. It's very, very challenging. So I hope that most of us have retired the idea of, get a job, because like I said, people have one. And for a lot of people, getting through today is a full-time gig, and it takes a lot of work.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that you mentioned the problem with work, because that is a common thing that you'll hear. But we talk about the systemic overlap between animal welfare and social issues a lot. But the reality is those jobs exist. The jobs that are very low paying exist, and those jobs are going to be filled by somebody. And there's always going to be someone more vulnerable that the system will find to take those jobs. And those people are going to be placed in a situation where they are low income.
Absolutely. Yeah, you nailed it.
Thanks so much, Brooklyn, for sharing some of your experiences. You've worked on the downtown east side of Vancouver for much of your career. What are some of the common challenges people living in that area experience?
Oh my gosh. That's a great question. And I feel like the first caveat I would put on answering that is, I have a lot of different types of privilege. I don't live in the neighborhood. I've worked down there for a long time, and I have an enormous amount of love and respect for the neighborhood as a whole and for folks down there. But it's tough, right? Because I can say what I observe, and I'm happy to answer that question, but it is tough, because I think that one of the things that comes to my mind a lot is so many of us are coming from a really well-intentioned place. It's often from people who are very intelligent and very compassionate and very empathetic, who have a lot of ideas for things that, we've read about, we've heard about, we believe that will help them out. And I think it can be really tricky, because I try to remind myself, because I've absolutely been that person that I'm describing who thinks I have a lot of great ideas, and maybe some of them are great, and maybe some of them are just not what someone wants. And I try to remember that, we need to be as guided as possible by self-determination by everyone down there. Because at the end of the day, these are all human beings who are all extremely aware of what they individually want and need. And those needs are definitely not the same for each person either. And so I say all of that, being mindful that some of the really obvious things are poverty, right? When you ask, what are the common challenges? Poverty, really intense poverty is a very, very difficult issue. So, my preamble there was to stay away from generalizing. So I don't want to say everyone is in poverty or everyone is in abject poverty, but a lot of people are in very intense poverty. And by that, I mean they do not have the basic amount of money to survive, sometimes literally, or with any level of dignity from month to month to month. So poverty is a huge issue. We've been living through a severe poison drug crisis for 7 years now. The numbers every year of people, human beings, people I can name who have died from it, people I've known and cared a great deal for, I can't conceive of the level of trauma that causes, right? When this is your neighborhood and people you see every day and you see another poster go up of, so-and-so has died. The level of, again, baseline trauma that is in someone's life it's something I'm very lucky I can't relate to because it's not my life experience. There's a lot of issues, in the neighborhood. I was at an event on the weekend where a lot of activists were talking about, the level of over-policing and under-resourcing. There's so much money going into the area for, monitoring and policing, and like literal policing, VPD, and there's so much of an under-resourcing that people are dealing with when they actually go through a violent incident and they need help or they want help. It's often not there. So that's one of the issues. Cost of living is absolutely an issue. There's not a lot people are allowed to put towards rent from government assistance checks. So that's a real challenge when you've got someone who, like we've talked about a lot already, who loves their pet with all their heart, and the well-being of their pet is at the immediate forefront of their mind, and they want to do the right thing, but they don't know what to do for a dog who stepped on a piece of glass, or for a dog who is, somehow starting to vomit, and that's not normal for their dog, and they want to do the right thing, but they don't know any better than I would, right? I'm not a vet. I wouldn't know what the right thing to do is, and how are we supposed to get a pet to a vet? Another big issue in that situation too is people, let's say they've called us, we've had a conversation, we've built a relationship, we've confirmed some funding for this person to go to the vet, and now they have to physically get to the vet. And that's tricky too, because, we might be able to say, here's some money to go to the vet, but now they have to either get their, 100-pound dog on the bus. And a lot of drivers may well just say, that's not practical, it's not safe, I won't allow it. Or they need to get a taxi, and okay, great, that's going to be $35. And where are you going to find that $35? So that can be a real challenge as well. There are so many things I feel like are just like inequities and challenges in the neighborhood that I could talk about all day. Yeah, the criminalization of poverty, being treated like you're a criminal just for being poor in a public place is really challenging. Racism is a huge challenge in the neighborhood. It's a huge challenge in the world. Gender-based violence is something that people have been doing a lot of work on. There's a lot of issues there. Again, there's a lot of issues with gender-based violence across the world. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now. But there's a lot of issues that people have talked about over the years.
Yeah, thanks for giving us a picture of what that looks like and what the lives of the people you work with, what kind of challenges that they're facing. What is it like to provide support to such a wide range of people experiencing multiple barriers in their lives? How do you keep from taking that all on personally?
That is a very valuable question, I think, for anyone in any form of animal advocacy, especially because we come to this work because we care a lot. In general, we care a lot about animals. We care a lot about human animals, non-human animals. And it's very easy, I think, for us, because we're empathetic people, to overextend ourselves to the point where we can burn out. So, I don't want to say that I have all the answers, even for my own self, or any of the answers for someone else, perhaps. But, there's a few things that I try to keep at the forefront of my mind when I approach this work. I think one of them is just remaining self-reflective throughout our careers. Because I think especially in a career like social services, animal services, you're going to see really hard things. I think that it can be very easy to see the challenges, but I would say it's just as easy if you remember to look, which is easier said than done sometimes, for the amazing successes where you get to see, someone has a lot of barriers. They've called you, they couldn't get to the vet, transportation, they couldn't afford the vet, all these different things. And then you're able to say, yeah, here's the money that you need to get to the vet for, a checkup, some x-rays, blood work, medication, a hospital stay, whatever we might be able to approve. And we were able to get a volunteer to drive you to the vet. And the volunteer was a lovely, empathetic person who stayed with you and emotionally supported you. And your pet got the treatment and they got better. And now they've gone home again. Seeing the benefits to this work they're everywhere, right? Like, these cases overwhelmingly end happily. There's so many more wonderful endings than there are really sad and really hard ones. But with it in mind that this is an industry that's very heavy in burnout, where a lot of people do see these hard things and, you see it once and maybe you can bounce back, and you see it twice and maybe you can bounce back. And, we all have a different point, but maybe on the 20th time, you just can't bounce back anymore. And you just find yourself thinking, those thoughts that go through someone in an animal welfare's heads, like maybe just like pets are just doomed. Why should I try? Human services, humans suffer so much. It's never going to get better. I'm not going to be able to fix the social problems, the systemic problems. So why should I try? anymore and we burn out. So I try to remind myself, and I don't succeed every day. I don't want to give off the impression that I've solved this or that this is something you can follow these easy steps and you too will have a satisfying career in social or animal services. But I think part of it is remembering why we do this. And I think another big part of it is having a very clear sense of what I individually can realistically and reliably provide to folks. And there's certainly a big piece of that that is beyond my personal ability. You know, when we work for, let's say, like a huge structure, a huge social service agency, where there's hundreds and hundreds of staff and, you know, dozens and dozens of managers, CEOs, et cetera, you're really at the mercy, I think, of how good your team is, how good your leadership team is. Because if you don't have a very clear image of what your job description is, this is the support that we do provide always. This is a support we kind of provide sometimes when possible. And this is support we never provide. When you don't have that, I think that the probability for burnout is so high because the realities are shifting every day. So I think having a really clear parameter, and especially in something like the McVitie Fund, you know, I would love to say we had endless money, but we just don't. We have a set amount of money that we can work with. And knowing that that's reality, this is what we can provide to people. And I find that that's really, really helpful for mental health, my own mental health, and knowing, I think the reliability piece is a big piece of it. Like, what can I do that someone can rely on? What can I tell everyone who calls that we can do? We will always listen to you. That's something I can promise callers. We will always listen to you. We will always care about what's going on for your pet, and we will always try our best. I can always promise to try, but I can't always promise to fund you. And I think that knowing that really helps me feel like I'm doing something, even if I can hear you out and not be one of the many burned out people who I've also been the burned out person right on the phone who just says, no, like we can't help, click. So I understand. I don't want to say like those are bad people because I don't think that they are bad people. I think people get burned out and just say, no, I can't help you, click. So if I can be someone who can tell you, no, I can't help you, but let's talk about it for a little bit and let's explore some resources. Can you give me a bit of a picture of what's going on? And maybe I can send you some referrals to who might be the best place that might be able to help you. And I think in terms of, you know, the sustainability piece, like the burnout, emotional, mental health sustainability piece, I think something that's really important to talk about and that I haven't heard a lot, certainly some, but not a lot of discussion of in human social services is just that mistakes are normal in everything, right? Mistakes are normal in every part of our lives, but they're certainly normal in this work. Like this work, you can learn it in school, you can train, and you can learn a lot of amazing applicable skills that way, but it doesn't come from a manual, right? Like when you're dealing with, like I said before, a unique human being, every single conversation, and someone who, you know, the thing I usually say works great for almost everyone, and then I say that same thing to someone else and it's really upsetting for them. It's very destabilizing. They're very upset by it. It doesn't mean that I'm a bad person, that I said the wrong thing. And trying to really, really remember that mistakes do not have a relationship to the quality of your character. Mistakes are normal. Things that work a lot of the time don't work all of the time. Yeah, the thought process, you know, like I made a mistake, so I'm a bad person. Or the flip side, you know, I'm not a bad person, so I couldn't have made a mistake. You know, all of us have so much that we've learned and also so much learning that we have left to do. And I find that when we approach working with people whose lives we may not understand, it's important to allow ourselves to accept our own selves when we need to learn something new. And if we're wrong, it's okay to be wrong, and it's okay to apologize, and it's okay to learn a new thing, and it's okay to refine our approaches when we talk to each other and to people. All that said, my last point that I would say about, you know, burnout culture and all of this mental well-being and sustainability in doing this work is about like substantial real self-care. And I would say I'm uncommonly lucky to work with an organization that talks about the impacts of trauma on those who call us, and, you know, the ways that our relationship can flow where we can cause trauma to the person we're speaking with on the phone, and also the way that trauma can be caused to us by hearing very, very difficult stories sometimes and very difficult disclosures sometimes. A lot of times I think, you know, we see a lot of, you know, what I call like Instagram self-care, you know, bubble baths and, you know, exercise classes, things like that. And it can be those things. I don't think that those are bad examples of self-care, but I don't think that that's the complete picture. I think that, you know, in work like this, in any job that is psychologically demanding and psychologically taxing, I think it's so critical to have what I would describe as substantive, or like what other people have described as real self-care. That's the kind of things that include trauma therapy, someone to really talk to who can help us understand that there's a science to how this processes in the brain. A traumatic disclosure actually, it can physiologically change your brain. It can change your reactions. It can change a lot of things about how you feel now. It can change how you feel long term. So access to trauma therapy, being able to take paid time off when we experience psychological impacts from our work, having people to talk about these issues when they come up, connecting with nature, land-based healing practices can be incredibly valuable for many people. Cuddling our pets, I think of as a huge part of my own self-care. Whenever I have certain types of difficult talks with people, I'll just think, I'm so glad my little one is here. Right now, even though I know that they're not immortal, I'm not going to have them forever, I'm so lucky that this is a moment where both my cats are in very good health. They're here, they're happy. Safe housing, I think, is a huge part. Medical care, all these, anything that is a necessity to be healthy, safe, and secure in our lives. Those are all things I think of as substantive self-care.
That's a really good overview of trauma-informed care, and thank you for delving into your own practices and your work. A lot of what you talked about there is what we refer to as trauma-informed care. And if you, the listener, are interested in learning more about that, if you're in animal work or just a community advocate, the Vancouver Humane Society does have a training program on this about trauma-informed care, incorporating that into your work, and also on reducing the effects of compassion fatigue and burnout. And you can find that at vancouverhumane.ca/training. And you can find so much more information about all of this. There's 3 2-hour courses on it.
Thank you so much, Chantelle. Certainly, we get a lot of people contacting Vancouver Humane Society concerned about animals living outdoors, on the street, or animals that are being cared for by people who are drug users. How would you respond to people who have concerns about animals that are living outdoors with their guardians?
I mean, that's you said a mouthful there for sure. That's a very important question that does absolutely come up a lot. And I think that there are different mindsets from people who would all agree with each other that we care a lot about non-human animals. We care a lot about pets and their safety, security, happiness, well-being, all of those elements. From how we discuss topics with each other across society, across debates, et cetera, I always try to start from the perspective of where are we completely in alignment? And I think if we can start from the perspective of, this person is sounding to me like they're communicating that they really care about the well-being of the pets that they're seeing around the city, I'm 100% on board with that. And I think that is what I hear from guardians as well. That's my experience when I talk to guardians who are unhoused. I would say the majority of guardians we speak with are housed in a literal sense. They have an address. Often it's, those single room hotels, some of which are much better than others, some of which are much worse than others. A lot of them are pet friendly, and so a lot of people do have cats, dogs, rats. I've seen rabbit. I'm trying to think if I've seen any other species, but there are a lot of pets in the SROs, the single room hotels. And for the buildings that are on the worst end of the spectrum from a safety and dignity perspective, I'll see a lot of people who, even though they actually do have housing in a literal sense, they'll spend a lot of time outside, even sometimes like when it's too hot, because I think very few, if any of them, are air conditioned. So when there's a heat wave, people will jump into their tents in the park or on the street or just be outside a lot of the time. And then we do have a lot of people who simply are not housed at this time. And so a lot of it is having relationships across the sector and trying to be as intertwined as possible between animal services and human services, so that we have a lot of conversations with support workers from housing organizations, from public health. I get actually, for me, I found it surprising amount of calls from social workers. Nurses have called a lot and referred clients to us because they work with folks who are unhoused, and they immediately, from a public health perspective, immediately understand how critical it is to their human clients' well-being, the well-being of their pet. So that's really heartening whenever I have those conversations where someone is starting from that perspective as well. But it is tricky when someone just disagrees or doesn't think that someone who is profoundly in the grip of poverty should be allowed to have a pet. I find it challenging emotionally because this isn't a concept to me. These are people. Like, I obviously, for confidentiality, will not name them, but I mean, these are people who have names. I know these people, and I can tell you that they care profoundly about their pets. And these are the same people who buy that $45 bag of cat food first with their last $80 so that their cat has food for the rest of the month at all costs. And these are people who will do incredible things. I've had people call and say, I'm going to sell my the motorbike that is the only way they get around so that I can get this pet the surgery that they need. These are normal conversations that I have with people. So I would just say, the level of love, but also the level of practical safety and companionship that they provide each other with, that this pet is receiving from this guardian. I would say it's absolutely on the same par as what I'm providing to my pets or to anyone else. I've even read studies too where people have noted that in a lot of cases when someone is sheltering outside and doesn't have housing at all, they're with their pet almost around the clock. So that can be really, really critical for some pets who have separation anxiety, or for a lot of pets. I think a lot of our pets would love to have that much companionship and that much emotional support.
Thank you, Brooklyn. This makes me think of Pause for Hope, another organization that's working in the Lower Mainland to help keep pets and guardians together. They released a report called Connections and Companionship. Chantelle, what can we learn from that report?
Yeah, that's a really interesting report. So it highlights how pets can offer emotional support to young people who are experiencing hardship in their life by providing stability and comfort. It also highlights how pets can facilitate bonding between youth and foster parents and be a source of security and comfort for youth who are in government care. I found it interesting that young people experiencing challenges were more likely to have a pet. So, like if they were experiencing poverty or had run away from home in the last year or experienced discrimination, had a physical disability or challenges with their mental health or substance use, they were more likely to have a pet than people who weren't facing those challenges. The report doesn't get into causation, so it's not clear if this is an example of the phenomenon I mentioned earlier where people who experience challenges want to help animals who are in need, who are also experiencing challenges, or if these young people adopted pets to help them cope with the challenges they were already facing, or a combination of the two. So even though most young people with a companion animal in their lives said that they experienced benefits to their well-being, young people who weren't well off financially were more likely to miss out on accessing needed veterinary care. So 38% of people who weren't well off financially missed out on veterinary care for their pets that their pets needed, compared to 5% of people who were financially well off. And worrying about the cost of pet care also added an extra stressor that led to participants in the study reporting poorer mental health and having a pet presented problems with youth accessing housing and other services for themselves.
Thank you, Chantelle, for covering that. And just thinking about agencies, Brooklyn, what are some of the other agencies that are providing support to people that you collaborate with, and in what ways do you collaborate?
Oh, that's a great question. Collaboration is absolutely key, especially like I mentioned before, we don't have the limitless budget I think all of us would fantasize about a nonprofit having. So with the realities of what we are able to do in a year, it's essential. I always look at, my job with a situation, let's say we've got a $2,000 surgery to save a pet's life. If we can contribute $500, this is a puzzle. I look at it as a puzzle. How do we find the other pieces that we need to make this puzzle come together? And I find that it's a challenge, but I love puzzles and I love social service real life puzzles. So in that sense, we're really, really reliant on, it looks like an ecosystem in my mind of organizations who have a very similar perspective and a similar value system and work really hard in, different ways, providing different types of supports to pets in these kinds of emergencies. So you mentioned Pause for Hope. That's absolutely an agency that we work with a great deal. I have massive respect for. The BCSPCA is a group that we work with a lot as well, especially their Vancouver Animal Hospital does incredible work. Constantly impressed by their team. So that can be really, really critical, for additional funding for a hospital that might be able to offer a discount on the procedure, making a $2,000 procedure a little bit less of a sting or less of a mountain to climb. Who else do we work with? We work with a lot of shelters and a lot of nonprofit housing providers. Is a huge amount of our referrals come that way. And again, I think that our work flows in both directions, where our goal is to help ease their stress and ease their work when they've got a pet who's been attacked and is, physically injured, or a guardian who's really stressed out about a pet who's showing signs of a very serious illness. We can help in that situation. And they also help us out a lot when I've got someone calling me and saying, I've got a veterinary problem, but I don't have anywhere to sleep tonight. And, the weather is starting to get bad and it's raining really hard and I don't want to have my pet. recovering from something in a place that's not safe for them to recover. And so that's where we'll go to the shelter list, and I'll be calling shelters, or I'll send them a list of resources to contact and try to find, either a housing advocate or just different shelters that are pet friendly and might take them in. Pet friendly piece is a big piece as well, because not every shelter is pet friendly. And, in Vancouver, it doesn't come from the greatest reasons. We have a lot of social services, but it's because we have a lot of poverty and a lot of people going through that experience. But when you get into some of the smaller towns and cities across BC, they may have one shelter within a few hundred kilometers. So if that shelter is not pet friendly, you've got people making decisions, almost all of which end in, I will shelter outside with my pet, then shelter inside and leave my pet to the elements. So that can be another challenge as well, and where we rely on these resources to help provide the care that is needed for the human and the pet. Transition houses is another one. We work with a number of transition houses over the years who are helping women fleeing domestic violence, gender-based violence, and a few are pet-friendly, and most are not pet-friendly. I think I've heard a bulletin recently that may have changed since the last time I looked into it in detail, so don't take me as absolute fact on that. But the last time that I needed to help someone find a resource for getting out of an unsafe situation with a dog, there wasn't a transition house that had space for her. So there's lots of issues in that sector as well. Other than that, we work with a lot of pet food banks across the province. Those are amazing resources. And at the end of the day, I think a lot of this boils down to we are doing the best we can as individuals and as small organizations and sometimes as large organizations to try to pull together survival for a lot of pets. And sometimes my job doesn't entail providing survival to humans, but a lot of people's do, right? Like there are a lot of nurses that we work with. There are a lot of housing providers who are providing survival resources to people and their pets. And it is a lot of challenges for all of us to do this as separate organizations, even as ones that work together in an ecosystem, because this is not government funded like human medical care. And this isn't a resource there's a clear series of steps for what you do when you go through a crisis and money is not available. If money is not available, this is a much, much, much bigger, sometimes insurmountable problem in a way that it isn't with human medical care.
Yeah, thanks so much for mentioning that. I think it's crucial to understand why people are facing the challenges that they're facing. With the limited government resources focused on providing basic needs for structurally vulnerable people, pets are often left out of the equation. There's one government program that the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction is providing some hope. It provides people the deposit needed to access housing with a pet. So that deposit is really crucial. We're hoping more advocacy will lead to agencies that provide human services also having a budget line for pets. Organizations like Atira Women's Resource Society now have dedicated staff to assist with pets, which is really amazing. Brooklyn, in your mind, what would an ideal model for support for pets and their guardians that are struggling financially look like?
So that's a really good question. And it is one that's hard to give a specific answer to. Different organizations do provide these kinds of resources and supports in different methods. I definitely don't feel like there's one method that is the best method. I think that there are just different methods. The way that we've settled on is to provide one-time crisis care funding for pets in an immediate life-threatening emergency. There are reasons why we feel strongly that that's an excellent method. And there are things that are not possible in that method, such as continuing care. And, there are other organizations that have a different approach where they'll work with the same pet throughout the duration of their whole lifetime providing care. And there are obviously huge benefits to that method. And there are challenges when you can only realistically afford to take on so many pets, and then a lot of pets are being turned away. So I really don't feel like there is one method that is the best method. I think that there are just different methods, and I think it's really great that different organizations are providing care in different ways. Hopefully together, I've said the puzzle metaphor before, we can kind of come together like a puzzle piece and make this all come together for each pet as much as possible. On the whole, though, I think it's really important that any model to support pets and guardians in crisis, it needs to, of course, be trauma informed. I won't go too far into what that is, but it's really important to treat everyone with the dignity that they deserve, regardless of the specifics of their circumstances. To be trauma-informed, we need to be non-stigmatizing and always be reflecting on our programming and for ways for it to be easier to access and more inclusive. I know that's a huge ongoing priority for our programming. And at the end of the day, it is really challenging for a bunch of different organizations to be working on this separately instead of in a cohesive government-funded way.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. So we like to end the episode by sharing sharing something that our listeners can do to make an impact with regard to the topic of the month. So are there any actions that you could share for people to take today to help animal guardians access resources for their pets?
Yeah, I think that one of the core things that our program, we can do so much as a program. We do a lot, but at the end of the day, the struggle is tangible budgetary realities. Is just what we do and don't have access to. There are certain parameters we have to put on our programs of how much we can fund the same pet in a year and in their lifetime so that we can keep going, so that we don't just run out of funding, after a few months every year and turn away every single other pet throughout the year. And the real challenge is just donations. I know we're very, very lucky to have a lot of monthly donors and a lot of people who are very generous and will do birthday fundraisers and just the most incredible things to help pull these funds together for pets in crisis. And it absolutely all matters. It absolutely all makes a difference. And that money, when it's earmarked for McVitie, it goes directly into medical care for these pets. So there are pets, who will not survive without a certain surgery or a hospitalization or medication today. And the relationship between the donor and the recipient is such a close one. Folks will donate and then a pet is able to get emergency life-saving care. And it makes such a difference. So I would just say the more funds we have, the more we can do with them.
Also, just to add on the longer term systemic issues, doing advocacy to get these programs funded is also really important. Like you mentioned, veterinary care is not subsidized like human medical care is. And we know that, of course, animals have value inherently in their lives. And they also have these major benefits for their guardians, like mental health benefits, physical health benefits, emotional benefits. And advocating for those resources to be funded can go a really long way in making those programs accessible to people.
You said it.
Thank you so much, Brooklyn, for joining us and talking about all this today. And thank you to everyone for listening. One thing we spoke about today was the emotional labor that's needed in animal advocacy and compassion fatigue and burnout. And we want to delve even deeper into that in the next episode. So please join us next month as we discuss how to handle compassion fatigue and burnout as an animal advocate.
Thanks, everyone.
The Informed Animal Ally is a podcast by the Vancouver Humane Society. If you found this episode helpful, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and review to help us reach more supporters of animals. To support this project and other initiatives to build a kinder world for animals, you can make a donation at vancouverhumane.ca. You can also follow the Vancouver Humane Society on Facebook at Vancouver Humane Society, Instagram at Vancouver Humane, or Twitter at Van Humane. The music in this episode is the song Jonah's Message for New York by Dr. Turtle, licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International Public License. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being an animal ally.